Gentlemen, the time has come once again to discuss things.
Got it sheath it, I've got like a coil, and then we get into the physics of the thing, and it's hi everyone, we are your geeky gentlemen. I am a geek for fun.
I'm that Matt kid.
And I'm Steve.
Oh shit!
Special guest returned. We have Steve back on the show
Why
for
else
this
Steve
episode.
appeared?
Oh my God.
It was super effective. We were all intimidated. And we've got Steve on this episode for what's going to be, comparatively to our previous few uploads, a bit more of a heavy topic, I guess, but also just an intriguing topic. Matt, you were the one who came up with this, so I don't want to steal your thunder. What are we talking about, and why did you want to talk about it?
We are talking about sort of the separation of art and artist in the age of the Twitters. And I joke, but I mean, it is definitely very serious because it seems like day in and day out, we hear about some creator who is horrible in some way or has said horrible things. Even today and yesterday, we were getting, new things coming out about people in the comic book industry, people in whatever, in the film industry, what have you. What kind of got me thinking on this, the one that probably hit me the hardest, was Chris Avellone. Chris Avellone being one of the key members of Obsidian, which is one of my favorite fucking game developers. Chris Avellone, one of the lead designers and writers on KOTOR 2. Chris Avellone, who worked on Pillars of Eternity and Fallout New Vegas and like games that I hold like near and dear to my heart. And he's been accused of, sexual misconduct and harassment at like conventions and stuff like that. And so I sat there and I'm like, that sucks, but I can't pretend like if I sat down and played KOTOR 2, I wouldn't still love KOTOR 2 because it's just such an ingrained thing that I care about. And so I just started thinking more and more about how, these days with so much social media presence, both from fans and from the creators of themselves, it's harder than ever to find that separation because you can enjoy a piece of fiction in whatever media it is, and then you can find the fucking writer's Twitter and find out they said something horrible about trans people or some shit, and next thing you know, you're just like, oh, well, fuck. So it's, I don't know, it's just something that's got my brain thinking, and I guess how ethically I can still enjoy things now that I know that the people who were key to creating them are people that I don't care for as people, you know what I'm saying? So that's, there's probably not going to be a good answer. It's a messy topic. It's a messy thing. And it's good that all this stuff is coming out, like all the stuff that's coming out about like Ubisoft, for example. It's good that all this is coming out, but man, it's rough. So that's kind of where my head's at right now.
And it's something where I feel like there's such a direct link when you invest yourself in these things. Specifically, like, let's say there's a lot of people who childhood were invested in, like, say, Harry Potter books with J.K. Rowling, and they take morals from these. They take, these things really helped me with this so-and-so situation. A lot of people you'll see come out will say things like that to that effect. And while it's always good to show like support of a work and stuff, whenever things about these creators do come out, there does rise the question whether it be right or wrong. It's like, well, should you be praising those works after that, right? Should you be showing support to that person? The idea comes back, but when does the art get away from the artist? Is it possible? Or is it already its own thing? Does it already exist in a different ether? And the ideas of it being construed as, we actually, the creator is the art, you can't separate it. Is that just like kind of a construct we've made as we've got more ownership of like rights, and people actually buying things and the mixing of art with product, I guess I should say, has that made us impossible to? Because I had this conversation with someone on Twitter. He was a friend, Jesse, and he said he couldn't really understand the idea of wanting to separate the art from the creator, from like a more legal standpoint, where it was, well, they are the rights, that they own that property, they own that franchise or what have you. You can't separate that. So that's a view I'd never really expected to get, but I believe that is something which you run into as well, outside of just the moral thing of just, is it factually possible to get it away from these people, or what have you. So my stance on it kind of leans in the middle between those of just the wishful thinking and like the imagination and the creativity thinking of just these are ideas and you can't copyright ideas, and then there's like the sad truth as we continue to work within these industries, it's like, oh well, no, actually you can copyright ideas, we will take your ideas and we will use these things. So that's something I'm really struggling with at the moment, and I'm wondering if going into this conversation, I'll come out of the end of it with a more definitive view, because it is tough. It is tough when you'll say, oh, I love all the new work that's been done on a new series like Castlevania or something, and then you find out, oh shit, Warren Ellis is actually a scumbag, and he's also the guy who's kind of responsible for raising many of the most prolific writers in comics at the moment, and they all came from an environment that he was using to abuse people in. Then that just kind of makes you sit back in your chair for a moment and think, what the fuck I've been spending my money on in this industry for, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Steve, you've been quiet. Yeah, I was waiting. I was
waiting. I was gonna let Steve. I didn't know if Steve wanted to jump in or not.
Yeah. So what's interesting to me is basically what we're talking about is a more modern version of that really cliche and beaten over the head on the internet idea of death of the author. For people that don't know, Death of the Author is this really famous essay by a French philosopher about whether or not, when the work gets produced, if the author and the thing they wrote can be separated. And the famous question that essay opens with is, who's speaking? When you read a line of Harry Potter and Harry says something, is it Harry that's talking or is it J.K. Rowling? And through that essay, I mean, there's lots of things about it that are interesting, but through that essay, most people take the conclusion that, well, there is a difference, that Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling are not the same thing. But that essay was written in the early 1900s, maybe a little bit later in, and art and copyright and stuff and Twitter, and none of that was there. It was all very, very different. It was a hugely weirdly landscape. And then years down the line, one of my favorite French philosophers, Michel Foucault, wrote an essay called What is an Author? And the idea behind what is an author was he turned the opening question of Death of the Author on its head and said, what does it matter who's speaking? And he's basically asking, why do we care about the fact that authors and their creations have this really contentious relationship with each other? And he proposed this idea called the author function. And the author function is basically a way of saying that an author as a category, as a thing, is actually kind of different from even the real person that's writing things. That there's J.K. Rowling, the physical human being that has life experiences. But then there's also J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, that owns more of it than any living author owns any of their stuff in recent history. And then there's Harry Potter. And that there's different historical reasons and structural reasons and legal reasons that J.K. Rowling, the author, the function, has certain kinds of powers and can twist certain things. When Orson Scott Card was outed as being a bigot that hated gay people, a lot of people said part of the problem with supporting his work is that the money you are giving him is going towards bashing gay people. J.K. Rowling's a really similar case, dialed up to 11, because she has far more wealth than Orson Scott Card does, and she's got a much bigger media empire than Orson Scott Card does. And so supporting Harry Potter is supporting a kind of function that J.K. Rowling does. But then there are other cases where the author and their work have like these giant divergent points. Comic books are a really good example of this because writers just kind of jump on to characters and they don't really stick or become functions in themselves because of the character. Like Tom King's in some weird Twitterverse trouble, and we could probably get into some of that later because it's weird and stupid. Mm-hmm. But Tom King is not Batman, as much as I hate to say that. He is not Batman. So it's very easy to make the split between, I can totally like Batman, even though problematic people have written him in the past, because hundreds of people have written him in the past. In other cases, though, it's a lot more muddy, like J.K. Rowling being the big example here. But for me personally, the big thing that really bothered me a few years ago is when Joss Whedon's ex-wife penned this really great essay about all of the abuses and infidelity that Joss Whedon had explored for years. And for people that were really big fans of him, like I was growing up, a lot of this is not really new information. Like there were interviews where they said that he was just really passionate, but if you read what people were saying, it sounded like borderline abuse. There were a lot of people that said really bizarre and terrifying things about him and then ended it with, but he's a great guy. And then his wife, like James Marsden's a really good example of this, like where James Marsden, like apparently at one point got pinned to a wall by Joss and saying, I will kill you off because my show is not about a love triangle between a teenager and two vampires. And then James Marsden was really terrified by that altercation. And he's like, but I understand. It's cool. It happens. And then the stuff his ex-wife said about how he would have, like how he would cheat on her, about how he would manipulate young women that he cast in his shows. And then you go back and you start to watch Buffy and you start to watch Angel and you see there is some really kind of rapey vibes all over the place, not to mention actual physical rape and stuff. And that show's problematic. And then Ray Fisher's come out and said that Joss Whedon's behavior on the Justice League set was like horribly abusive and it was enabled by people like Jeff Johns. And so for someone that really, really likes Joss Whedon's work, I love Age of Ultron, I love Angel, Buffy, I love basically everything he's ever done. I love all of it. I even have a tattoo of Angel on my arm. It really does hurt to have this person who, for all intents and purposes, early on seemed like a good, positive version of masculinity to aspire to that wasn't hopelessly toxic, that wrote about things like life and death, that wrote about respecting people. And it turns out he was just full of shit. And it's hard to make that separation when so much of why you like his work is because it's got these through lines all the way through. But really quickly, I think what you realize is no one takes the same thing from a work. And while there are sort of like institutionalized meanings behind certain projects and stories and art, that something like Harry Potter or something like Batman takes on kind of like a mythic quality, and all of it sort of becomes totalized under one kind of meaning, no one engages with it the same way. No one comes to it the same way. And so it becomes really easy, at least for me, at some point to say, Joss Whedon created this, but he has no power as a person over how I choose to take it and how I choose to wield it, even if it's against him. The trouble, though, is you circle back to certain people like J.K. Rowling and Orson Scott Card, where it's really hard to enjoy it without at least tacitly endorsing what the person is saying.
I don't know. You bring up a good You bring up a good point, though, because I think personally, at least in the Harry Potter fandom, I think what I've seen just based on my friends and the people I've interacted with in the fandom, there's almost like a reclamation of that material, right? Like in the same way the queer community reclaimed that word queer as part of their own lexicon and part of something that they now kind of take pride in. I feel like a lot of people who I've interacted with who are bigger Harry Potter fans than I am, don't get me wrong, Harry Potter was never a big thing to me because I grew up in a good Christian household. No joke. But I've seen like a lot of people say, okay, yes, J.K. Rowling has said all these things, but fuck you. This material means something to us, and we're not going to let you ruin that. And you've had that with like the actors coming out, like with Daniel Radcliffe saying, hey, I don't know about all that. So, I mean, it's interesting seeing the fandom almost try to take it from her in a sense, like trying to claim what they love about it. And trying to say, we all agree that we love this, and we all agree that we are not going to stand for the types of turf rhetoric that are being thrown around. At the same time, though, you then have to decide, well, can you then comfortably go see like a Fantastic Beasts film? Because that's money that's going directly to her. Like if you pick up your copy of Chamber of Secrets and read it, that money, like JK's not seeing a dime of that. So can you love the material that's already there? Can you avoid consuming new material? Is that somehow better or is that somehow different? And is there a statute of limitations on any of this shit? Like, yeah, sure. Did Bob Kane kind of screw over Bill Finger a little bit? I mean, yeah, sure. Does that ruin Batman for me? Like, no, of course not. So there are kind of, I feel like in some situations you almost have to look at it case by case basis, because no one's trying to argue that what J.K. Rowling has said has been not terrible, but I've seen a lot of the fandom use this as a way to come together and reaffirm, if you are a trans person in the Harry Potter community, we love you and we care about you and we support you. And so I think that's kind of interesting to see the fans try to wrestle it away from the creator almost.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's something where, I mean, it's a tired adage, but it's still painfully a true one, where there is no ethical consumption in capitalism, right? You can't unbuy these books. You can't get rid of the joy that work gave you before you find these things out. Doing so would just be doing yourself a personal disservice. You'd be lying to yourself if you were affected by the words of this person, and then later on you found that. I think the difference is, and this is all personal, everyone in the world really has to make the choices about what they specifically are okay with in encouraging and what they want to buy or what they want to spend their money on. We all kind of have, like, you want to get an Amazon parcel, like, that's kind of a moral thing you have to ravel with. There's no right answer for that, just because the world we're in so far is designed to, if you start thinking about every single thing about that stuff, you just have to become a hermit. It's the only way to live completely morally at that point. So there is no this playbook, there's no rule book, that is personal. But I think is the good thing about what you're pointing out there, Matt, is that's a very different thing from not looking at something critically. When you get people who will be like, say they do, I really like Buffy, and I know about the Joss Whedon stuff, but I'm going to go back and watch Buffy, and I'm not going to think about any of that. Like, right? Like, because you have to. You can engage with the material without, and still enjoy the material, but you need to be able to look at it for the full spectrum, including that. I know I've gone back and read some Warren Ellis comics, and I've read them differently now, because I know what that guy was now, and I know what that guy is, and I still get enjoyment from certain works, like Batman Planetary, fantastic one-shot story, but I also look at stuff like Spider Jerusalem, I'm like, okay, I see there's a lot of stuff in there which tells you more now that you have the context. And with any art, right, that's kind of how we've always done it historically, even, right? You go back and you will read Shakespeare or Bram Stoker or what have you, or even I think the bigger example then would be Lovecraft, right? The reclamation of Lovecraftian myth by POC creators has been a beautiful, wonderful thing, and that's probably the biggest example of that, where this is a guy that was just hate walking, but people have managed to take the concept and ideas that he may have just randomly had that spawn from that and have took it from him and manifest it into something else. So, but the problem with that is whenever you see people who will use Lovecraftian fiction and just repeat it verbatim, and like, oh, I don't care about Lovecraft as a person, I just like his thing, but they're just repeating the hateful messages that are in Lovecraft's work, because they're not being self-aware enough to realize that's what they're doing.
Yeah, you have to be able to revisit that material. And what is it that fucking Anita Sarkeesian always says? It's possible and often necessary to enjoy something while being aware of its more pernicious aspects. I mean, if you want to go back and consume that material, I think it's fair to say that it's absolutely okay to do that, but you have to do it almost responsibly. Like, you have to, I think it's if you want to consume it and do it in a way that you yourself can ethically justify to yourself, I think it is important to examine it with the knowledge that you have now when you look back at it, for sure.
And I think it's also important not to work too hard to distance yourself from the fact that you liked it in the first place, kind of like what you were saying before, Alfie. One of the biggest problems I have with people who go to these issues and their instant reaction is either to love it unabashedly and ignore it, or on the other end of the spectrum, cancel it to such a degree that they act like it never meant anything to anybody and that we can't like it at all. Is that both those responses are exaggerations, and both of them are really bizarrely inhumane and egotistical, because you, as a single individual person that read Harry Potter as a kid, really has no power whatsoever over canceling J.K. Rowling. Like, that's just not going to happen. You choosing not to read your copy of Deathly Hallows, or you telling your friends not to read Deathly Hallows because of what J.K. Rowling says, doesn't really so much as touch what Harry Potter is culturally. It doesn't touch J.K. Rowling's wealth. It doesn't touch the conversation that's happening about the issue. And so you can't just deprive yourself of it as if it doesn't exist. You have to wrestle with the fact that your individual choice is not something that you can ascribe to every single person out there that does or doesn't like these things. You don't want to come to some sort of performative closure for these sorts of issues. You can very easily just go on Twitter and start ranting about how this creator has these political views, therefore anything they do is bad and I won't touch it. But that's really dishonest, and that really doesn't get at the heart of what your individual choice is and how you choose to look at those works. I mean, if you try not to read something or watch something because someone problematic was involved with it, you're not going to be reading or watching basically anything. And that's not a justification for any of that. It's just a sad state of the world. And so you have to take what works in some things and wrestle with it and see if you can turn it around. There are some things that are worth redeeming. There are other things that are not worth redeeming. But these are individual choices, and the internet gives you a community space to have these conversations with people. But you can't ascribe your sort of queasiness about them to everybody.
I think you also have to be careful when you're dealing with larger entities, right? So Ubisoft, one of my favorite game developers historically, behind Prince of Persia and Assassin's Creed and all that good stuff. Shitstorm has been coming out about them, about how higher ups at Ubisoft have been covering up and shuffling around people who are known kind of abusers of lower people in the company and things like that. Some people are being allowed to gracefully step down rather than being fired. And I mean, it's been a fucking shit show. I mean, it's insane. And so there's a lot of people out there who are just well, fucking, I guess, boycott Far Cry 6, don't get Assassin's Creed Valhalla, all this shit. And that's something that's interesting, because it's yes, the people who had the power to do these things did all these horrible things, but these are works of interactive fiction and art that are crafted by hundreds and hundreds of people, some of which were victims in all this, some of which didn't even know it was happening, some of which are just people who are passionate about doing their job and creating something enjoyable and things like that. So obviously I'm not saying that, people really are going to I don't think anyone's going to boycott Ubisoft in enough numbers that those people are going to be dramatically hurt. But there is something to consider when you have something where it's just well, you got to sit there, and are you going to sit there and do mental math and figure out, well, was the problematic person responsible for 50% of the thing or 25%? It's, if you start going down that path, where do you stop? You know what I'm saying? Do you suddenly stop enjoying things with Darth Maul in it just because of what happened with Ray Park, even though Ray Park is just a small facet of what makes Darth Maul a character? No, probably not. So I think J.K. Rowling is an interesting situation because it was her. She wrote the books. So it's a little bit easier to just go back and look at her specifically. But then when you have large groups of people working on single pieces of fiction, and only a portion of that group of people is what you would consider problematic or cancel worthy, at that point, where do you start drawing that line? Because if you start trying to go down the line and anytime anything shows up that's problematic, I mean, you're it's like you guys said, you're not going to enjoy anything ever at all.
Well, and what's interesting when you talk about the larger industries, because Ubisoft's a really good example, Dynamite now is a really good example because of their support for Comicsgate. The other larger problem here is when you focus on what these individual people are saying, is you can very quickly take everything bad that's ever happened in this particular context and ascribe it to one person and act like exiling them somehow solves the problem, when it genuinely doesn't. Like, okay, fine, don't read anything Warren Ellis has ever written ever again. Just completely bar him from the industry. Make sure Warren Ellison never writes another comic ever again. That doesn't so much as touch sexism in comics in general, because Warren Ellis isn't somehow the originator of this idea of grooming and abusing women. He's just the next in line for a very, very long chain of people that have been doing this for decades, particularly in comics, which have always sort of treated women terribly, which still denies women opportunities, which has historically been a kind of males club that grooms women to do certain kinds of things. And certain powerful female creators kind of coalesce around each other, but are still really quickly thrown completely under the bus by the male industry. And I mean, this isn't just unique to comics. This is everywhere. So like the fact that Ray Park did this revenge porn thing you don't stop the epidemic of things like revenge porn by just canceling Ray Park. Like, it's a much bigger and wider issue here, and focusing on the individual people and their relationship to the art really sort of erases that all of these things are being made in a context. They're being made in a context with a really long and sordid and complicated history. You want to first ask the question, can you enjoy Star Wars again? Yes or no? And that's a very personal, enriching thing that you decide on your own. But then two, you have to take the larger step and say, what is it about Star Wars that allowed someone like Ray Park to enter in it in the first place? And was that unusual or not? Because if it's not unusual, then Ray Park is just a symptom. He's not the disease.
Right. It's like railing against a specific company for unethical practices while not also railing against the capitalist machine that allowed that to flourish.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these are complicated things, and you can't just act like every piece of individual responsibility solves giant systemic issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of going back to, you mentioned near the start of this conversation, Steve, about like the arrogance and the kind of the egotistical idea of the I'm the person who will stop this, right? Like, I'm the and like, granted, I guess it does come from a positive place, at least if you're giving them the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes it can just be to have a meat for the kill, right? It's just how mob society works. But the idea that if I go after this person, and if I bombard all their attacks, their accounts and everything, I will be solving sexism in comics, right? If every single tweet I do is about how Jeff Johns sucks ass, and yeah, Jeff Johns, for what he's presumably do, sucks fucking ass. But if that's all you're doing, you're moving away from the issues, and you're just propping up a figurehead, right? You're propping up the idea of the bad guy that you can defeat, then the next one will come along, and then that's kind of why nothing ever gets done about these issues, because whenever something is done, it's moved on to the next. Especially on social media, where it's like there needs to always be a target, and there's two thoughts about this, because while at the same time the idea that a lot of people will say is like, cancel culture is destroying everything, and cancel culture, it doesn't exist. It's not a thing. That no one's been cancelled actually, and fucking their lives have been ruined from it. It's never happened. They're rich. They're fine. Like, it's the myth of that. The myth that hate mobs are going to things when actual people who are being harassed and sent death threats will never speak out about this, because they're the ones actually on the receiving end of these things. That whole thing doesn't exist. It's not a thing. But I do think there is the desire to attack someone, and I guess the most recent thing, because we did bring it up earlier, would be the whole Jay Lee, Tom King, Comicsgate situation. This, like, legit, the day of this recording, this just happened today. And Tom King is doing a Rorschach comic book, and their variant cover of that was done by Jay Lee. It came to Tom King's attention from people on Twitter telling him that Jay Lee had done covers for Comicsgate, which is a hate group. If you're on Geeky Channel and you don't know what Comicsgate is, you're probably on the wrong channel. But like, Tom King then distanced himself from that publicly and expressed disappointment. Jay Lee then goes on his Instagram, and rather than seemingly being insulted at, oh crap, there's a hate group who's using my art, that's so annoying, thanks King. He instead was like, damn you for saying this thing that I did, it's an attack and I don't like this. And I think that, and again, like the whole cancel culture is ruining people, and then this goes on to a whole thing where people are now saying, Tom King came about this the wrong way, Tom King should have done this, and you can have your own thoughts on that, but the idea that there's a wrong way to call out shit is kind of the problem, right? Is like the idea that you have to be perfect in your approach to how you address being dissatisfied with creators or the art that creators use. Because again, Jay Lee's a fantastic artist, a very unique style, but when his art is being used by a hate group, it is his responsibility as the artist to come forward for that and do the research of what his thing is being used for. And if he doesn't, of course people are going to talk and make those assumptions, right? Which is kind of the other thing of like the artist for the art versus the artist. When the artist swears up and down that they're not political, I think is another problem where, oh, your work may have some hateful messages on it. Do you want to comment about that? And was that intentional? And say, oh no, I wasn't thinking about anything about that. Or your art has a very positive statement. Would you like to tell us about that? It's like, oh no, I wasn't thinking anything about that. That's a whole other bag of just like when they don't take responsibility for anything.
Yeah, that frustrates me too, because I mean, that's the only instance in which I will say something akin to like bad cancel culture can exist, when it's a situation where it's like, okay, Tom King, Jai Lee, maybe neither of them handled the situation flawlessly. Like maybe that's your view. Maybe neither of them handled the situation with like the way it should have been. But at the end of the day, this is such fucking small potatoes. They've, Tom King figured it out. He said, look, here's the situation. He even talked to Jai about it. He said, look, it's all good. He didn't know. And I mean, yeah, like people seemingly erasing that it's kind of Jai Lee's responsibility to know who he's doing work for, but whatever. So like, whatever. That's such fucking small potatoes versus like Jeff Loeb saying no one cares about Chinese people. Like, I don't even fucking care. Like, even if, because like that's the one instance I'll say, like if someone says something kind of stupid out of ignorance, or if someone just doesn't handle a situation super well, that does not mean they did it out of anger or hatred or they deserve to be #canceled. And don't get me wrong, a lot of times nothing really ends up happening to them. But I have seen occasionally there are times where people are just out to find something to rail against. And so that's the only time where I will kind of agree that like a bad cancel culture can exist. But at the end of the day, it's not like anything bad really happened to Tom King because of all this. I mean, it was just a goof. It was a misunderstanding, basically. So, I mean, and the people who deserve to be, quote, canceled, like J.K. Rowling, yeah, no one can fucking touch them. So it doesn't even matter.
Yeah, I mean, the Jay Lee thing is a really good example of something I said earlier, where there's the person, there's the individual who makes decisions, has experiences, lives their lives, yada, 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 that just happens to be an author of some kind. And then there's the author, the sort of like legal personification that has all their ideas wrapped up into this. And some people do a really good job of separating those two personas out. Like they have a literary persona and they have like their daily life. I think Tom King is actually a pretty good example of this, where like there's Tom King, the writer that you know, and you understand that all of his work does kind of exactly the same thing, and he sort of just leans into it. And then there's Tom King, the human being who posts pictures of his dog and worked for the CIA, and that has its own complicated history. But CIA Tom King and Batman writer Tom King are two different people as far as like understanding his work goes. And then you have someone like Jay Lee who leans so heavily onto he's just a dude that he doesn't think of the responsibility that his art has, like you mentioned. But then you look at someone like, what's his name? Jerry Conway, who made The Punisher. And the second he realized that the Punisher skull was being used for racist T-shirts and racist hate groups and stuff like that, he tried as much as he could to try and distance himself and that art from it as much as possible. I have my own thoughts on whether or not that's a good thing. I mean, I really don't think we need Black Lives Matter Punisher skulls. I think that's a really creepy image. But he tried. He understood. He saw that his creation, him as his author, him in his limited capacity as a legal entity that works for Marvel has a certain kind of power and responsibility, and he wants to take ownership of that responsibility. And that's noble and that's helpful. But you see other people, going back to Joss Whedon here, where like the second the letter his ex-wife wrote came out, dude just went radio silent for like 4 months and everyone forgot about it. The stuff going on right now with Ray Fisher and accusing him of being abusive on set, dude just goes silent. And no one's probably going to hear from him until his HBO show comes out or if the HBO show gets canceled. So it's interesting sometimes where there are people that want to just like plead ignorance or just kind of completely ignore the fact that they as an author has a certain kind of responsibility to the things they put into the world. But we don't often examine their lives with a lot of nuance, and we don't often think about what is it about these kinds of people and what is it about this kind of industry that attracts so many similarly minded people. Like, Comicsgate's a movement that started within the comic book industry. It wasn't just one dude. It wasn't just Ethan Van Sciver. It wasn't just that Dynamite decided to support it. It was this long, sweeping thing of just years and years and years of casual sexism that sort of became its own personality, that became a trope, and then suddenly people associated so hardcore with it that even if you cancel Ethan Van Sciver, you don't solve the problem.
It's one of those things where I guess a question I want to ask then is, because we've all kind of been, I mean, we're on Geeky Gentleman, and like this show's biggest history has always been kind of predominantly on comic book based things, and being guys in that comic book circle, you get to experience and you get to see all the kinds of shit that gets done with all of that, all the kinds of thing that gets said by creators just casually. I think the biggest example recently is what you mentioned about with like the Jeff Loeb thing, right? Of just how could you get to a position when you can just fucking say that in a writer's room and feel no fear, right? Where you're just like, I will just say this and now people have to listen to me, and then people will have to then go tell the actors that you said this, and they have to bite their tongues until years after the fact, after the show they worked on has been fucking cancelled, right? Like, to where it's no repercussions whatsoever because there's no hope of it coming back. So, like, that level of security for people to say this level of shit, you're very right, Steve, that doesn't just come from one person. That comes from ingrained years upon years upon years of, well, that's just the way things are. I'm sorry, I can't change things. It's always been like that, so on and so forth. I think that's exactly how you end up with people like Jeff Johns, all the way up the tier in that sphere of power. Where you
and going back... Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, it's fine. I was kind of coming to the end of the point there anyway.
Well, so going back to the beginning of what you said there, like, Geeky Gentleman's been primarily about comic books. The name is Geeky Gentleman. We primarily have men on this show that talk about these things. I think importantly, what we need to mention here is that a lot of these things that these people are getting, quote unquote, canceled over, a lot of these things that these people are accused of, they're not things that make sense in a real sense to people like us. Like, we are not the targets of systemic sexism and racism inside the comic book industry. We're not even the people that have the most experience in seeing it when it happens. We're just people that have watched it unfold and now have a certain kind of platform so we can talk more about it. But as far as like the three of us are concerned, to relative degrees, there's a kind of there's a level of comfort where like comic books are written for us. Right? They're written for overcritical dudes in their 20s and 30s at this point that don't need to think about these things. And so when you start trickling this issue out and you have people that aren't targeted but still care about it, I think that's an improvement. But the bigger point for me here is sometimes when this stuff happens, when sexual assault allegations come out, you see people say things like, it's really easy to not be a shitty person. It's really easy not to be a sexual predator. It's really easy to do these things and avoid this. And I think, and maybe this will be the hottest take of the conversation, at least I have, is I don't think that's true. I absolutely do not think it's true that it's easy to not be a shitty person. And I absolutely don't think it's true that it's easy to not be some kind of predator, because these behaviors are so ingrained and are so part of the characters that we appreciate and are so part of the dialogue we have every single day that it actually takes a lot of work to realize that even if you per se didn't do anything terrible, you might have been complicit in something. Or it takes a lot of work to say, oh, that's why this person was so hurt by this. Years ago, there was an alternate cover of Batgirl where it was a Killing Joke parody, and it was basically like Barbara terrified with Joker behind her, like painting a smile on her face. And I said something to the effect of like, I don't understand why people are so upset about this. It seems fine. And only after many, many conversations did I realized, oh shit, that was a horrible thing to say. That was absolutely not fine. There is an entire history of this specific woman being terrorized by someone like the Joker who was sexually assaulted by the Joker. That was deeply not okay. But I didn't get it at the time. And the more we see these people come out and do these things, the more we try to shift responsibility to like, okay, let's just blame them. Let's push them out. Let's get rid of them. But at the same time, you can't just point the finger at them. You have to stop and think, okay, what are the things that they've said and done that I may have also said and done? What are the things that I didn't think were problematic that other people had to teach me were problematic?
I 110% agree with that, because it was way easier for me in my early, like my late high school to early college years. It was way easier for me to fall down the anti-feminist, anti-SJW rabbit hole than it was for me to get out of it and then become someone who feels like he can talk about these things as an ally to women and marginalized groups who feel not safe in these spaces. So I 100% agree with that. I think, in theory, we as individuals who have no real power on a systemic level and are not surrounded by other people who also have that power, it's easy for us to say that. But as soon as you get into that culture, and to a degree your success in the industry is arguably affected by your ability to successfully ingrain yourself in that culture, it becomes very hard to separate you as someone who is a big wig at some large company from these things that you might be doing, because I mean it's just such a part of what all these people do, because you're surrounded by it. And it's so, I mean, I agree with that for sure. I think it is way harder than people realize to just say no. I mean, I know that's kind of undercutting it a little bit, but I mean, yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the biggest examples I can bring up about that, with like a comic book thing, of it being hard to make that distinction for people who just don't know, who haven't, because this is just the way society makes you think of these things. You don't really realize that, and that is kind of the character of Daredevil and like the comic book history of Daredevil, where Daredevil has been both at once incredibly empowering, while also incredibly ableist. And that's kind of like a thing that's been mired in the history of the character, where you'll have Matt Murdock will say in his defense when his identity comes out, I can't do those things, I'm blind, right? The idea that a blind person would use that as a defense of I can't do these things, I'm blind, kind of throwing blind people under the bus a little bit with that. But at the same time, it's also this idea of like, well, Brian Michael Bendis is a sighted person. He can't really ever hope to understand the ideas of what a blind person goes through or a non-sighted person goes through. And that's the biggest example I can give, just because Daredevil's immediately one of the most big ideas of like, well, there's not a lot of blind writers in comics, so of course Daredevil's going to run into a lot of problematic shit now and again. Despite how much research people put into it. That's the easiest example, right? But you bridge that out and you're like, oh wait, yeah, maybe if there's not a lot of female writers in the comics industry, you're going to get a lot of women saying things. If there's a lot of black writers in the comic community, then maybe, yeah, you're going to get a lot of stereotypes, and so on and so forth. It's just because the ideas are so insular. And I think this also spreads out beyond comics to just writers, right? With J.K. Rowling, and despite how much she loves to play every bigot's favorite card, oh, I can't be this, I have friends who are that. She clearly is so out of touch with the communities that her actual work have inspired. Like, there's a massive trans Harry Potter community that she clearly doesn't understand what she's fucking saying. Because when the author does, specifically when it is just a single author, it can be hard to catch this. I've been on a big writing project on my own at the moment that has been announced elsewhere, but one of the advantages of that is having a writer's room where we specifically try and get as many different people from different backgrounds as possible to be able to call out shit if we're doing something strong. Like, Grant Morrison is one of my favourite writers in all of the world, but even he fucking has some very words when he comes to trans people. I think that's just because he's not as educated with that thing, or his treatment of Talia al Ghul and women in general has been dissected by people far smarter than me all over the shop. But doesn't stop me from enjoying Grant Morrison comics, and doesn't mean I should cancel those books. It just means when you engage with this material and you are absorbing so much material that, like you said, Steve, has just the characters act in a problematic way, so people who imprint themselves onto those characters, who gain moral value from these characters, will kind of repeat those patterns of behavior. It is your responsibility as a fan of these things, if you really do enjoy them, to educate yourself and look critically back at those things so you can get that word out there. And even if you don't have like a Geeky Gentleman podcast, if you just say that to your friend who's reading The Dark Knight Returns and doesn't understand that the politics of that is pretty fucked, you're doing some good, right? It becomes a much more individual thing, not on the sense of the individual will change the industry, but how all things gets done, which is through community work and through support groups and actually forming a cohesive unit where if everyone pitches in and if every writer gets to talk about, oh, well, this part was offensive to me, but I really liked this part, and so on and forth, we'll have a much wider and much more in-depth appreciation of art and the human experience than currently the old white boys club getting to decide what is morally right and why Superman shouldn't take a political stance. Because, of course...
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite points to bring up here is that criticizing something is not designed inherently to demean it. The internet has made us think that criticizing means that you don't like something. But in actuality, the reason you criticize something is because it has value. It's because you care. That it's because that this thing has status and support that you feel like you need to look at it with a critical lens and examine what's going on. Because if it didn't have value, there'd be no reason to do that in the first place. You don't see anybody going out of their way to like talk about and criticize and bash Family Guy because we all know it's shit. No one cares. It's a terrible, terrible thing. It's destroyed the animation industry, and adult animation will never be good again because of things like Family Guy. But that's beating a dead horse at this point. There's nothing to learn from that. Whereas you start thinking about like Daredevil again being a really good example. I love Daredevil. He's my favorite Marvel character. I love Bendis' Daredevil. I think it's probably one of the greatest, if not the greatest, running comics ever. That dude pulls some horrible, horrible shit with female characters in that book. Frank Miller's like big trick in his original Daredevil run was to kill Elektra. And it was this horrible, penetrating rape metaphor. Like, that's awful. It doesn't mean I can't like Daredevil, but there needs to be some sort of reflection of like, because I love Daredevil and because I value these characters and these writers and what they've said and taught me, that I owe it to myself and to the people I talk to that say, hey, look, this is really cool, but this is not okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's really all it can come down to is that. But I mean, let me ask you, is there, because absolutely it's important to be able to look at those things and it's important to be able to criticize while still enjoying, but has there ever been a situation where something has been legitimately completely ruined for you because of something that the one of the creative heads of it did? Can you think of any example that you struggle to find that ability to go back to it even critically?
That is
Not
tough.
off the top of my head. I mean, Harry Potter might be a good example because I mean, I liked Harry Potter well enough when I was a kid. I read all the books, I saw all the movies. I tell this story a lot where Daniel Radcliffe and I are not the same age, but we're close to the same age. And every year, just for some bizarre reason, every time a new movie trailer came out, inexplicably, Daniel Radcliffe and I ended up having the same haircut. And so I was like this sort of pasty white looking kid with glasses that always had Harry Potter's haircut. So in elementary school up through middle school, everyone just called me Harry Potter. So there was just this weird association with Harry Potter that I had growing up. But I was never in love with it. And now J.K. Rowling being a TERF just makes me not care about it even more aggressively. I don't imagine I'll ever go back and watch the Harry Potter movies because I just don't care. So, I mean, it didn't ruin it for me, but I don't see any reason that I would ever go back to it.
Yeah,
I think
that's fair.
The only ones I can come up with off the top of my head is I think it's already depending, like a personal thing. If I was already predisposed to, I don't know if I really like that stuff, and then I find out that they're a shithead, then I'm really not going to bother even talking about that stuff to bash on it. Like, I really don't like Doomsday Clock. And part of the fun on Twitter for a while was just making fun of Free Jokers and Doomsday Clock and all that. And then he even trying to get me, why don't you read Jeff Johns' Green Lantern run? It's really good. And so I was actually planning one day to, maybe I'll do it for Daddy. But after finding out Jeff Johns kind of a skeeve, I'm like, I'll put that one on the shelf. I don't need to spend that money. So like, that's put me a relief. The Jeff Loeb thing is, again, Batman Hush, one of the most overrated thing in the world. I don't need to go back to that. I think the one that actually has been ruined for me, though, like that one that I actually did enjoy previously, was Superman American Alien. I really liked American Alien. I thought that was like a really, really great book. And then everything about Max Landis came out, and he was already kind of in the periphery of like, this guy's kind of but then it comes out, he's an actual rapist. And then it's just like, okay, I just can't touch that book again, especially if it's a Superman book for me. Like, the history of the Superman titles for some reason has always been really gross. Like, look up Eddie Berganza and his fucking reign of terror on the Superman as the Superman editor, and all the horrible, horrible stuff that happened with that. So that's one I can't go back with. And then to find out, this might be a good segue as well that I want to talk about, to find out that they're now making an adaptation of American Alien. They're not calling it that, but it's the latest Superman movie that they're making, the DC animated one, is an adaptation of American Alien. And it's like, out of all the fucking ones you could have picked, we could have got Birthright or something, you're going with the one made by the rapist. Good move, DC. How do you guys feel about when a work and a creator are recognized as being cancelled, what have you, or things come to light where we now know of it, but it seems that the people in charge don't care and keep promoting it and keep continuing the media? I guess like the idea of like Dean Cain keeps getting interviews all the time despite everyone knowing he's a fucking shithead. Stuff like that, like where although the work is being critiqued and being criticized, for some reason it's still being held to high regard. Like, I would sincerely doubt, just because of how much money DC makes from it, if this affects them doing reprints of Hush at all. After what Jeff Loeb's come out with, like, and said, like, I think they will still continue to promote that book like hell.
Hush on its own is the entire 21st century of Batman poster books, so there is no way they are going to not reprint it.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard because, I mean, like, things I can't really go back to, like, I don't know, like The Usual Suspects. I have no desire to go back and watch that. Really, it's a lot of X-Men movies are kind of like, I already don't look super fondly back on the original, like, X-Men trilogy, so it's hard for me to, like, go back to it even now. So that's the only one I can think of off the top of my head. But, like, at the same time, they're not really continuing to promote that stuff. In fact, the X-Men movie franchise is kind of fucking dead in the water at the moment. So I'm having trouble. Like, I get what you're saying. I'm having trouble thinking of one off the top of my head.
So for me, the thing that immediately comes to mind is Roman Polanski, because one of my favorite movies of all time is Chinatown. I adore Chinatown. I think it's a fantastic film, and I still try and force people to watch it with me as much as possible, but it's hard because it's like 3 hours long and really boring. But Roman Polanski is a terrible, terrible person. He's a rapist. He's a child molester. He's abused women for decades. And the dude still makes movies. He still gets nominated for awards. The only reason he doesn't come to the U.S. is because he'll be arrested if he comes to the U.S., but he can still release his movies in the U.S.? Like, that's just insanity. And that's just one of those things where, like, there's nothing I can do as an individual. Like, I can't boycott Roman Polanski movies. Roman Polanski is one of those people that his name is an institution unto itself where, like, he can just kind of do whatever he wants. He doesn't have to make money. He doesn't have to do blockbusters. He doesn't have to get a superhero movie to get attention. He can just make movies, and regardless of whether or not they make their money back, they'll get released, and he'll be allowed to make another one because he's just Roman Polanski. That's just how he works. But there's no way out of that at this point. And so it takes a special kind of like caveat to introduce this topic when you want to watch that Roman Polanski movie with somebody where you're like, okay, look, we're going to watch Chinatown because I adore it and I think you'd love it. But you should know that the guy who directed it is a terrible human being that has not been arrested yet, but has a warrant out and he has not come back to the U.S. to be arrested.
Yeah,
Put that on the back of the DVD.
Big ass caveat. Yeah, that's a DVD quote there.
The trailer.
It's like a Surgeon General's warning, but just for fucking Polanski. I guess one that comes to mind, it's not like a personal one for me because it's not like I ever really cared, but like Chris Brown comes to mind, right? Like Chris Brown.
Oh, yeah.
Fucking after everything that happened, like the Chris Brown train did not just like stop. He continued to be very successful. So that's for some reason that's the only example that's coming to my head. But that's a really great example of like, this is not just like he said some stuff online that was like kind of problematic. No, he beat somebody, and we just moved on after a period of time, and they're just like, oh, the new Chris Brown album. So there are situations like that where it's like they become such an unstoppable force of popular culture that it almost doesn't matter what they do. I mean, just look at all the shit that like Trump got away with in the lead up to him becoming president of the United States. At some level, at some point, you reach a level of fame and institutional power where you can kind of do whatever you want. And that's kind of terrifying.
To kind of bring this full circle, because I mentioned Foucault earlier, one of my favorite lines that he ever wrote is, truth doesn't make the law's life any easier. And I think that's absolutely the case. Like, it doesn't matter whether or not certain things are true. At some point, things are just going to work out the way they do regardless of the truth. And that's very depressing.
Mm. Well, thanks for joining us.
Oh, well, you know,
everyone down.
Yeah, it's just one of those things where, like, because it is one of those things where you just have to accept individual action has reached a limit, and you can only kind of really make a change. Because despite all of that, you can make a change with some certain things. Where, like, thankfully, DC has taken off the Batman's Grave from publication, which was Warren Lacer's Batman book. And again, despite how much money that was making them, so that was a good sign. The wave of support from comic creators kind of disavowing Dynamite has been fantastic to see. Stuff like that, you can see, like, okay, there's been, when people band together and do affirmative action as a community, that's actually when these things can start to change. The frustrating thing is it's just not fast enough, and it's not big enough, and it's so small, and it's so little bit by bit by bit. So there's not really like a parting word of advice I can give in terms of just like, well, if you do this, you'll be on your way. And I can't even say, like, again, throughout all of this, we've all discussed our complex feelings in regard to the topic of like works we like and such. So there's always going to be a personal thing where everyone, I think, is allowed their problematic fave, right? Like you can't go through life and really expect to be just completely saintly. You're going to find something that you enjoy that will have some elements in it. As we've said many times in this before, it just all comes down to what you as a person are comfortable with, and what you as a person are critically aware of. And if you're not, do yourself a favor, Google it. Just see what other people are talking about it. Specifically, see if you really like a book with a female character in it and it's written by all white guys, maybe see what some female reviewers on it say. It might give you a different insight than what you might be thinking. And it honestly, it's not it's fun. It's so much more rewarding. And if you are like a creator, if you are trying to be a writer, it's so much better to expand your horizons out of these bubbles that single authors will give you. Even the J.K. Rowling thing. There's a woman author, but her audience is so much bigger than that. Her audience spans everything. Harry Potter has touched so many different people's lives, and that community has made fan fiction, fan art, fan games, everything, and just took it and made it their own. To where, if we go back to your point, Steve, where like Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling the author and J.K. Rowling the person are different people. Harry Potter the fandom is an entirely different person from all of that still. Which again is kind of the beauty of it, where you can take these work and your headcanons are the only canon that matters. If you don't like what these people say or these words these characters say, you can strip them down to just they can just be the image of that character, and you can do what you want with that, and you can weaponize that, and you can do good with that. So never feel disenfranchised or powered, because you have the tools, right? If you want to make a story where Harry Potter is transgender at Hogwarts, there's word and you can type that in and there you go, you've just made that, right? And then no one can take that away from you, no matter what, no matter how desperately copyright law tries to. Don't worry, it's chlorid, it's coming for you. It'll never quite catch up to your head. So that's kind of the beautiful thing with storytelling, at least with it gets into a little bit with like the game development, like you said, with Ubisoft, or movie development, but even then, like, the ideas are what's most important, and the feelings they imprint on you, where you can take that and then you can strip mine all the bad shit that was from it, and then if you are a creative, you can then take that and make a better version of it than what was previously. I think that goes with just in anything, even if it's just you're not a creative and you just want to go through life and you actually found morals in the works of people who seem to be immoral. You can just take those morals and fuck all their other shit away. They're yours now. You can pick and choose what elements of a work you like and what you dislike. So never feel like again, I think Steve had said at the start of this, where everything needs to be cancelled whole cloth, or a character needs to be cancelled whole cloth. They're yours on a very individual level, and it's your responsibility to know what you do with them, though. So just be aware of that.
Well said.
Unless anyone else has got anything they want to go over, if we've got a few more minutes left. If not, we can just call it over.
I will say one last thing on this, because I think J.K. Rowling's sort of the paradigm example at this point. J.K. Rowling and social media are probably like the two big things that make this conversation different today than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Like it's always been the case that horrible people have made really good art, and something came out in the media and we tried to cancel them and it didn't quite work out. But access to creators through social media, the ability to distribute fan fiction, and the ability to completely turn one idea into some sort of like industry conglomerate like Harry Potter, these are all new things. So if you're feeling conflicted or confused or just kind of at a loss for the amount of information we experience on a daily basis, don't worry. No one has any idea what the hell is going on. And this is very, very confusing. So it absolutely has to start on an individual basis, because there is no normative idea on how to fix all of this.
Yep. I just think it's always better to try to avoid like purposefully living in ignorance of what's going on. It's better to, in my view, know and be aware that the writer of something you love has problematic aspects to them than to live in ignorance of that, because you can still enjoy a work by someone problematic as long as you, I'm not trying to tell people what they can and can't do, but I feel like it helps to be aware of those things so you can appreciate what's there to love and still think critically about the things that, you really are kind of hard to love because of what you know now. But that's kind of a good thing, because that means you can continue and continue being an ally, continue being part of whatever group you're a part of, and finding new creatives. I mean, that's one of the things a lot of people have said. Enough about bashing J.K. Rowling. Maybe we should talk about queer and different minority writers who are doing fantasy and things like that people who like Harry Potter might like. So I feel like if there is any good coming from this, it's just be aware of the bad and prop up the people who prop up the good, really.
I think that's very well said. All right then. With all of that done, Steve, we will be needing a review topic for next week.
Okay. So I actually just went back to this weekend, so it's kind of fresh on my mind. I'd be curious to see what you guys would end up saying about it. I don't know if this has been done on Geeky Gentleman either, but do you want to review the Arkham Asylum video game?
Oh
Ooh.
Shit! Yes.
Damn, let's do it.
Get fucking. Oh my god! I needed an excuse. I'm gonna go back and fucking 100% all the Arkham games. Fuck.
I literally replayed it on hard the other day, without collecting any of the trophies and stuff, but it was so much fun. So I was curious.
That's really funny.
Unfortunately, I can never play through Asylum without literally doing everything. I just have to. I just start and I'm just like, all right, I gotta get everything.
It's the most manageable one to do that with too.
It is, yeah.
Cut to Matt just in his Batman cowl. He's like, I'm when I said I have to do everything, I mean I must become the knight.
Oh, this will be fun.
All right then.
Man.
See us next week then for Batman Arkham Asylum. Yeah. With all that said and done then, we have been your Geeky Gentleman, and I am the champion of the oppressed.
I'm the Sonic Erotica lover.
I don't have a title. It's been too long.
Oh boy. And we will be discussing things. There it is.